really, Hume was an absolutely remarkable man, and there's no analysis of his life that can dispute this. And I'd really summarise it as an enlightened and humane Indian civil servant. He distinguished himself in the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. And he was also, as we all know, one of the seminal bird collectors, and he compiled what's still the preeminent collection of birds' nests and eggs of the Indian subcontinent, which we're very fortunate to hold in Robert's care at the Natural History Museum. But probably his greatest influence on public life was his important role in Indian independence, although he didn't live to see it. He was the driving force behind the creation of the Indian National Congress, which became the Indian Congress Party, and which has governed India for the majority of its post-independence history. And in an era of great energy, Hume distinguished himself. He was the product of a fiercely political family, and they instilled in him a love of science and a passion for justice, and this, I think, really shaped a lot of his interests and actions. Joseph Hume, his father, was a famous radical MP who made his fortune in the East India Company, so Hume's father already had a link to India. And Joseph Hume was a long-standing Member of Parliament for over 35 years. He was the acknowledged leader of the radicals, campaigning against the Corn Laws, for the extension of suffrage and the abolition of flogging in the army. So like his father, Hume the Younger devoted his life to political transformation and to India. Allan Octavian followed his father into surgery and into Indian administration. He attended the ICS, the Indian Civil Service, training college at Haileybury, and he graduated in the first class. His long, illustrious and ultimately checkered career in India began in 1849, and he was only 20. And as was the fashion in those days, as was usual, there was this tiny English class who ruled India, and he arrived with a smattering of classical Indian languages and little preparation for the practicalities of administering India. But Hume was very successful. By 1856, he'd risen to become the collector or the senior British administrator at Etawah in modern-day Uttar Pradesh. And his tenure visibly transformed the opportunities available to the inhabitants, and especially in education. He established a series of free schools funded by the zamindars, or the landowners. And by the end of 1856, there were 181 schools, nurturing over 5,000 scholars. And he also opened a secondary school and a scholarship scheme which enabled entry to agri college and thus higher education. And it's around this time, in 1857, that we first hear of Hume's interest in collecting, and we know that he established a small collection. And actually, in our day at the Natural History Museum, we discovered much more detail around this that I hope Robert will share next week. Hume's motivation for collecting is still obscure, although, like most of his compatriots, he was a keen hunter. But his plans for education and his nascent collection were disrupted by the Sepoy Rebellion that rocked British India to its core in 1857. This was a defining event in Hume's life, and his small part in these momentous events illuminates his character. As is well known, the unrest began at Meerut on the 10th of May in 1857, and within 3 days the rebels had reached Etawah. They were captured and shot, but on May the 18th, another group of fugitives took possession of a Hindu temple. Hume himself went to the temple, and despite the people supporting the rebels, Hume attempted to flush them out. His assistant was shot in the face, and Hume rescued him and retreated. Hume was able to maintain the status quo at Etawah for a few more days, but the troops rebelled and began to plunder the bungalows and treasury. By mid-June, all the English population had retreated to Agra Fort. Hume fought in the Battle of Agra on the 5th of July and distinguished himself by his bravery until laid low by cholera. He was not permitted to reoccupy Etawah until December, when he raised a local militia loyal to the British. Etawah was plagued by rebels from Oud, and it wasn't pacified until the end of 1858. Hume led many skirmishes and some major battles. He killed more than 100 rebels and was awarded a CB for his services during the rebellion. The situation in post-rebellion India was pretty traumatic, with many British bent on vengeance. Hume was notable for his clemency and fairness in dealing with captured rebels. His policy, in his own words, of mercy and forbearance was criticised by colleagues, but Hume believed that the people of Etawah were not rebels at heart, and the British needed to take responsibility for the part their rule had played in leading to the rebellion. The rebellion marked Hume deeply. He had seen at first hand, and I quote him, the whole grand apparatus of a highly civilised government shrivel up in a single month, like some emblazoned scroll cast into a furnace. Hume would evermore be mindful that British rule in India was precarious and that violence could erupt seemingly from nowhere, and this would later influence his actions as leader of the Indian Congress. After the rebellion, Hume reprised his zoological collecting. His reforms in Ottawa gathered place, and in 1859, in parentheses, the year of the publication of Origin of Species, he began to publish The People's Friend, a vernacular paper that became so popular far outside Ottawa that translations were sent to Queen Victoria. In addition to continuing to invest in the free schools, he founded a juvenile reformatory, which offered a far better alternative to floggings and other harsh punishments that were current at that time. As the collector of Ottawa, Hume was only able to develop his bird collection on leave or on travels within the district. In 1867, his excellent tenure at Ottawa brought him promotion to the Commissioner of Indian Customs, head of one of the great departments of India. In this role, Hume travelled all over North India, and his collection expanded significantly. His major achievement as commissioner, on which we have the expert here, Roy, was the abolition of the Great Hedge of India, a fortification that stretched 2,500 miles from Attock to Cuttack. Its function was to protect the government salt monopoly by excluding cheap salt from Rajputana. Hume negotiated a long-awaited series of treaties to regulate the salt sales. This quickly led to another promotion, to an office job in Calcutta as secretary to the Department for Revenue, Agriculture and Commerce. By this time, Hume had formulated an aspiration for his bird collection to cover systematically, I quote, entire provinces and dependents of the Indian Empire. That is, modern-day Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Burma and part of Malaysia, so an enormous area. In order to achieve this, Hume needed the fruits of his own and others' fieldwork. He began to organise major expeditions, financing them himself, although on official leave. And he focused on little-known areas, such as Sindh in 1871, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in 1873, the Southwest Coastal Islands in 1875, and Manipur in 1881. These expeditions were tremendously important. They set the foundation for systematic ornithology in India. The Sindh expedition yielded over 1,000 specimens, with 18 new records for India and 4 new species. The Andaman expedition brought 2,400 specimens and 198 new Bay of Bengal records. These were large-scale and costly affairs. Professional taxidermists accompanied the shooters, and by the time of his Andaman expedition, Hume was employing his own curator, William Davidson. Both British colleagues and companions and Indians shot the birds on these expeditions. And this is an area that we know relatively little about, the networks of collectors that Hume used and correspondence in order to build his magnificent collections. In addition to mounting his own expeditions, Hume made sure that his collection profited from others' travels and expertise. He established a formidable network of collectors and correspondents across British India. His contributors spanned gentlemen naturalists, medical men, army officers and civil servants. As well as procuring specimens from them, their observations and field notes are a core part of his published works. Over 200 correspondents are cited in the game bones of India, Ceylon and Burma, and Hume also purchased collections, including the notable Mandeli collection. As Hume's collection expanded and his reputation grew, he began to share his knowledge with a wider audience through voluminous publications. So he's amassed his own collection, he's run his own expeditions, and now there begins a phase of Hume disseminating his knowledge and putting his knowledge into the public domain, and he felt very, very passionately about this. He began with an article in the Ibis in 1868, and he quickly expanded in 1869 into his first book, called My Scrapbook, or Rough Notes on Indian Oology, which gives fresh and detailed descriptions of 81 Indian birds. Apologising for the imperfections in the book, he writes, "If I be blamed for innumerable errors and defects certain to occur in these notes, I can only plead First, they were jotted down in those rare leisure moments that the control of a vast public department, 2,000 miles squared, whose employees number nearly 140,000 officers and men, leaves me for recreation. And I thought that was quite a good insight into his voracious appetite for work and his ability to do an incredibly demanding job and to advance ornithological science in the way he did. And in 1872, Hume stopped being content with contributing to journals and founded his own journal devoted to Indian ornithology, Stray Feathers. The journal had a 10-year life, and as well as being editor, Hume contributed most of the articles, which again I think is quite an insight into his character. And these ranged from 30 to over 100 per volume. Stray Feathers became an important forum for keen ornithologists across British India, and really the 1870s was the peak of Hume's literary output. His status as the Pope of ornithology was recognised in his co-editorship of the account of Henderson's Lahore to Yarkand expedition, although he was disappointed in the ornithological results because they yielded only 158 specimens. He also nurtured future collectors by producing a manual on collecting and preserving birds. And the motivation behind his prolific publishing is illuminated in his next major work, The Nests and Eggs of Indian Birds, a rough draft which came out in 1875. And in it he writes, "There is not one single person into whose hands this rough draft may fall, who could not, if they would, add somewhat to the above. Will they continue, miser-like, to hoard their knowledge?" So he feels very strongly that people with knowledge should put it into the public domain and enable it to be built on. Nests and Eggs is a big work. It gives the complete life history of 700 Indian birds. And his most accessible work was the 3-volume Game Birds of India, Burma and Ceylon, which is beautifully illustrated and published between 1879 and 1881. And a stated intention of this well-illustrated guide was to help sportsmen recognise their quarry and thus add to the knowledge of bird distribution. So this time, Hume has got one of the most senior positions in the Indian civil service. He's publishing widely, and he's also constructed for himself a beautiful home, Rothney Castle in Simla. A contemporary account states that Rothney Castle, he spared no expense on it, transforming it into a grand palace with sumptuous gardens. He hoped it would be bought by the government for the viceregal residence, but it never was. And Hume arranged some of the larger rooms into an excellent museum and library. Bowdler Sharp from the British Museum describes it as 3 times larger than the meeting room of at the Zoological Society of London. A reference collection dominated the centre of the museum, and all around were tin cases of well-stored and labelled specimens. 8 basement rooms and 2 verandas housed the large birds such as vultures. Bowdler Sharp wrote when he saw it, "One ceases to wonder at the amount of work its owner got through when the